The Fisheries Museum of the Atlantic has the largest collection of objects associated with the original schooner Bluenose that we know to be in existence. At the beginning of the 18th century, Massachusetts fishing crews adopted a new type of vessel, or at least new to them, which was the schooner. And the schooner had many of the same principles as earlier vessels, although the rigging was slightly different. It is a gaff rig vessel that follows the fore and aft alignment, meaning that the sails and the rigging actually runs the length of the vessel rather than cutting across the vessel, as would be the case, for example, with a square rigger. Now, prior to the 18th century, the North Atlantic fishery was really conducted in one of two ways. Either crews would work from a small vessel close to shore, rarely leaving the site of land, and they'd be out for a day or maybe 2 days at most, handlining for fish over the side of their vessel. And they would then return to a small little, often it was a little fishing station or encampment, and the fish would be unloaded and it would be dressed and laid out on flakes, which are basically wooden drying platforms that would be about waist height, or else onto a rocky beach. So that was one method, and the other was the Green Fishery, which is a practice in which larger ships would go to the banks, typically off of Newfoundland, and they would catch fish, again handlining off the sides of these vessels. But everything would be done on board. It was almost like an early version of a factory vessel. The fish would be caught and pickled in a heavy brine, and they would then return to Europe, often without ever really making landfall in North America. But the adoption of the schooner meant that these two industries could be combined. They could be amalgamated. Vessels could go out to sea for 2 weeks or maybe even a little longer, fill their holds, salt the fish on board, begin that curing process, and then return to a fishing station or to a port community where the fish would be unloaded and washed and laid out to dry. And this allowed for a real kind of dramatic increase in the volume of fish that could be caught and could be cured in any given season. And that process really laid the groundwork for what would be the schooner fishery in the 18th and 19th century, and right up into the first half of the 20th century. And schooners were they were often referred to as the workhorse of the sea, and there were a few different reasons why they were so good and why they were such an effective fishing vessel. They were typically, especially in the earlier days, they were small enough to be easily sort of crewed and easily sailed, but they were also seaworthy enough to head out to the banks and to remain out of banks for a long enough period of time to be able to catch enough fish to catch in the hold. They were typically decked with a fish hole down below, which meant that they had the capacity to be able to store large volumes of fish, as well as have living conditions for the crews. Their hull designs made them fairly safe in the water. They also had a low draft, which meant that they could enter ports and harbors and coves that had slightly less water in them. They weren't quite as deep. And this could be really important. They may have had to go into a small port to gather bait, or else even kind of duck into a shallow cove in order to avoid an upcoming storm and ride out the weather. The schooner was also perfectly suited for our winds and our weather here. We have winds that can change quickly and flow in various directions. And a schooner, unlike some of the larger sort of square riggers, on a schooner, most of the actual rigging work could be done from the deck. So you could make any necessary alterations without having to climb the masts and be hanging from the rigging, which was very well suited for the changing climates that we have here. It's one thing if you're going across the Atlantic and you've got a straight course and the wind, while it can change, there's more consistency to it. In that sort of situation, when you have to climb up every now and then, it's not the end of the world. But if you're fishing out off Sable Island and the weather's changing all the time, it's a lot easier to be able to do it from the deck. During the heyday of the fisheries, the banks were swarming with fishing schooners. I've never heard or seen an actual figure for how many vessels were out there at one given time, but there were surely hundreds, if not thousands, of vessels that fished on the banks at any point in time during these heyday years. And these vessels, they came from across northeastern North America, from the maritime provinces, as well as from the northern part of New England and other parts of the United States. And they also came over from Europe, particularly from countries like Portugal and France. Bluenose was a proper Lunenburg salt banker. And like other Lunenburg vessels, Bluenose fished the offshore banks, from the Grand Banks off Newfoundland to George's Bank off the coast of the northern United States. Generally speaking, the first trip of the year would have been what was referred to as a frozen bait trip. And what that meant was that they loaded the vessel in port here in Lunenburg with frozen bait. Typically it was brought in on a train from another small community around Nova Scotia. And the vessels like Bluenose and all of the other bank schooners that fished out of Lunenburg would provision themselves, would be outfitted here in town, and they would head out to their chosen fishing grounds. Once they were there, they would engage in what was referred to as the Dory Fishery. So a lot of people don't necessarily realize that these fishermen weren't actually fishing off the sides of these schooners. Instead, they were launching smaller vessels known as dories, and particularly the Banks dory, which was a 15-foot dory, and two men would work in this smaller dory, basically fishing all around the vessel. There were two ways in which dories could be unloaded. One was referred to as a flying set, and that was when the dories were towed behind a schooner and they would let go basically at various points, generally about a half a kilometer distance from one another, and cover the fishing grounds that way. And that meant that you had a far stretch of the grounds that could be fished on, rather than being limited to just the confines of where the vessel was. The other method was for the schooner to anchor and for the dories to be unloaded and then span out in every direction. And again, the idea was to cover as much fishing ground as possible. And the fishing that they engaged in, unlike the earlier years where it would be hand lining, basically throwing a single line, you'd have multiples of the lines, but a single line over the edge and jigging. Instead of using that kind of a fishery, it was referred to as a trawl fishery, so a long line. The lengths could vary in size and length, but it wouldn't be uncommon for it to be, say, 2, maybe 3 kilometers long. A long line would be set with various hooks at roughly about an arm length apart that would hang down. So little lines would hang down with an individual hook, and each hook would be baited, and it would then be weighed using various kinds of trawl weights and anchors in such a way that the hooks floated just above the bottom of the sea floor, and then they would travel along the length of that trawl, gathering the fish as they went and retrawling. So the amount of time that it would take to actually get to the fishing banks could vary. So it varied on a number of factors. One would be simply the weather and the ways that the winds were blowing. The other would be the various steps that would be needed to take along the way. So while the first trip was a frozen baiting trip, generally the subsequent trips would be done with fresh bait. So schooners would stop at a harbor or a little port along the way and collect bait. So this could be, for example, places like Canso, Sydney, or southern Newfoundland. The trips themselves, though, they generally ranged in length from about 2 weeks to over a month, 4 to 6 weeks. And that would be the amount of time that you were gone from your respective port at any given time. But that does take into consideration stops in port and that sort of thing. In the world of the schooner fishery, the cod was king. Cod was the choice fish that pretty well all crews went after. There were, of course, various trips when a schooner may go halibutting, for example. But generally speaking, cod was the main choice. That said, they would catch and keep any groundfish that was available to them. So they may have been out on a cod fishing trip, but if they caught haddock or pollock or any number of other groundfish, they would still be kept, and particularly halibut. And halibut is a fish that would yield considerably higher prices if it was fresh. So that was the one kind of fish that even during the salt cod days, if they could, they'd keep a little stash of ice down below, try to keep it frozen so that they could throw their halibut onto the ice and try to race it into a port like Canso that was closer to the fishing grounds and sell it for a slightly higher price. Bluenose was built as a salt cod fishing vessel, and that's a process in which the fish is all preserved in salt. However, in 1936, she did have 2 diesel engines installed into her second fish hold, and that enabled Bluenose to engage in fresh fishing as well. Bluenose, of course, was the fastest of schooners, but still, the winds were not consistent, and she needed engines to ensure that she could bring fish to market in proper time before they spoiled. So in 1936, from 1936 onward, Bluenose could engage in both a fresh fishery as well as the salt cod fishery, and fresh fishing trips were shorter. It was generally closer to 10 to 12 days, maybe 12 to 14 days, in order to allow the fish to be returned to market before the ice melted and the fish spoiled. So for those who worked aboard vessels like Bluenose, schooners were workplaces, but also homes away from home. These were the crew's living conditions, and these conditions must have ranged from bad to worst. You can only imagine the stench of up to 500,000 pounds of fish in a hold directly beside your galley or forecastle, and this is not even considering the fact that the schooner had generally between maybe 20 and 28 men who didn't bathe for weeks on end. It was not uncommon for the pot of boiling potatoes to spill over on the stove as a wind hit the vessel. There's a wave hit the vessel and sending steam throughout the air. Filling these smelly places with hot steam. They were smoky. They were smoky from the stove, and you can imagine the blue smoke that must have flowed through them as well with all of the tobacco smoking that took place on such vessels. They also had no bathrooms, so it was a bucket and chuck it sort of situation. And I'm told, you'd go and find a place behind the dory, and if the weather was too bad, you'd just blame it on the dog. So there was these were harsh conditions to live in. Often crews would sleep in their oil gear because you didn't know at what point you might have to be called up to mend to the rigging, if the weather started to change, that sort of thing. However, one of the real kind of comforts that did exist on a schooner was food. Food and company, but food became a really important a part of life on a vessel, and it was really important to have a good, proper vessel cook who could keep the crew well fed, because well-fed fishermen made happy fishermen, and it's important to kind of consider how things may have changed even in the course of a trip, and how daily life and conditions may have changed as the crews were out there for longer and longer periods of time, and they started to get more and more exhausted, and their bodies started to break down. So, for example, the beginning of a trip, it may have taken 2 men to hoist a dory over the side of the rails. And by the end of the trip, it would take, it could take up to the whole crew to get the dory over, because their hands are cracked and caked with calluses and salt, and their bodies are starting to break down from intense and long days of work. A work day on a vessel like Bluenose typically started anywhere between 2 o'clock in the morning and 4 o'clock in the morning. The first thing you'd do is you'd jump out of your bed and you'd start baiting up. You'd start baiting your hooks, cutting bait and baiting your hooks, and you were over the side in your dory before you ever had breakfast. And only after your first trawl was set could you come in and have breakfast. And you would continue this process throughout the day, each time returning to the side of the dory and forking, easily 1,000 pounds of fish over the side of the rail of the schooner out of the dory with a little fish fork. So it was very physically demanding and very intense process. There's one story I can tell you from a Lunenburg County vessel, and it just sort of sums up what life could be like on these vessels and some of the conditions in which they work. So there was one morning where the fog was some thick and it was just greasy all around. And the boys were standing out around the deck waiting for the old man to come out, and they were wondering, were they going to get a day off? Was this going to be a rare day to maybe go down and play some cards or read a book, that sort of thing? But eventually, out comes the captain out of the wheel. He opens the wheelhouse door, and with his little dog Bozo, and he hollers, "Bait up, boys!" And he looks down at Bozo and he says, "Now you get back inside. It's not fit for a dog out here." And there were certain skippers, for example, who would take more caution, and with that sometimes they would take less pay because the fish they caught was not the same quantities. But they're very intense places to work and to live. But there was also a lot of camaraderie. Generally speaking, the people who worked on these vessels knew one another. In places like in Massachusetts, for example, especially in the early days in like the 18th century, and that it was uncommon for family members to ship together on the same vessel. It was considered to be too great of a risk, actually, because you could lose multiple people in one storm or on one vessel. But in Lunenburg and in Nova Scotia in the 19th and early 20th century, it was very common for family members to ship aboard on the same vessels. And people, generally speaking, fishermen started as boys. It was not uncommon for a boy to go to sea at 10, 12 years of age, and most fishermen had gone to sea for the first time by the time they hit 15 or 16 at the oldest. Oftentimes this was with an older relative who would take them out and show them the ropes, or who would have arranged a trip with somebody they knew. And in this sense, the risk of danger must have kind of been seen as acceptable because of the ability to kind of stay together and to help teach and groom younger generations of fishermen and to be there as comrades as well. So it was hard work, but there was also certainly a strong sense of community that existed within these vessels. And even in terms of the social structure and social hierarchy, the captain was certainly the authority and the boss on the vessel, but you didn't have the same kind of rigid hierarchy that was experienced on, say, merchant vessels or naval vessels. Part of what made Lunenburg so successful as a fishing port was actually that Lunenburg managed to become somewhat self-sufficient in the fishery. And what I mean by that is, vessels were built in Lunenburg, outfitted in Lunenburg. The food was grown in Lunenburg County. The crews came from Lunenburg County. They were, with a few, very small exceptions, most of the processes involved in the fishery could be done right here in town. And that meant that the fishery was ultimately a critical part in the development of the town and of the community. But it also had real, true social implications for how families lived and how families operated as well. For example, at times when it wouldn't have been uncommon, for example, for a woman not to be permitted to really own money in communities like Lunenburg and the neighboring, particularly neighboring communities where there were farms that needed to be run. Women were responsible for managing a family's entire affairs. They ran farms while also raising families, and as men were absent for long periods of the year. And again, in terms of when it comes to actually the community being sort of a self-sufficient fishery in many ways. The vessels were outfitted in Lunenburg, and the fish would come back to Lunenburg. So Bluenose, for example, fished out of Zwicker & Co. And Zwicker & Co., which is located here on the Lunenburg waterfront, outfitted Bluenose and then would take on Bluenose's catch once Bluenose would return to port. The fish would then be typically handed over to one of Lunenburg's many fish makers, which were basically individuals and small companies that would manage flake yards. So these are the drying platforms that the salt cod would be laid out to dry, and they would be responsible for drying the cod and turning it over to regularly throughout the day to ensure that it dried properly, and generally caring for it throughout the curing process, at which point it would be taken over again by one of the local firms and often exported elsewhere. Down south to the West Indies was a major market for Lunenburg salt cod, and that actually has that's actually fairly ingrained in the early history of the schooner fishery, and the reason being that because the schooner fishery is sort of amalgamated the two earlier forms of the fishery, the wet fishery and the dry fishery, into a type of industry where fish was heavily salted on board and kept on board for a couple weeks at a time. The quality of the product was not the same that it would have been if it was caught, for example, in Newfoundland with a small boat, brought to shore the same day and laid out and dried on the flakes. So it produced a lower quality and lower grade fish, a lot of it, but it wasn't quite the same grade. So the higher grade fish from places like Newfoundland, where it was caught and cured the same day, would generally be sold to markets in Europe. Lunenburg has a very long and proud shipbuilding tradition. The shipyard in which Bluenose was built, the Smith & Rowland shipyard, located here on the Lunenburg waterfront, was largely responsible for building and constructing Lunenburg's Banks fishing fleet during the first half of the 20th century. And what would often happen, actually, would be that these schooners, these new vessels, would be purchased and acquired by a Lunenburg firm or a Nova Scotia firm, and they would fish out of for a Nova Scotia company, often for a decade or between a decade and 2 decades, and then they would be sold to Newfoundland firms, where there wasn't the same type of a shipbuilding tradition. The forests, of course, were in Newfoundland grow slower and were cut down much earlier, so they didn't have quite the ability to build large ships. Certainly had a strong boat building tradition, but less of a shipbuilding tradition. So our vessels would often then make it down to Newfoundland, and they would fish for a Newfoundland company for a number of years, and in the end would often be sold to the West Indies again, and then would turn into freighters in the West Indies, where they would freight goods between islands down south, and that of course ended up being Bluenose's fate. Bluenose, like many Lunenburg vessels, was a working schooner. She's known for her racing history and her touring years, but she was a working vessel. And Bluenose, like other Lunenburg vessels, would fish the Grand Banks, and particularly in the early years when she was in better condition, when she was a newer vessel, she would be sent down to the West Indies to ship salt cod down to West Indies markets. Now this only happened for a short number of years, but as chance would have it, Bluenose was ultimately lost off of the coast of Haiti as she was sold to a West Indies firm when she was no longer viable as a fishing vessel and perished on a reef off of Haiti. My understanding is that she was had to make a passage between 2 islands with reefs on either side. I believe it was a mile or 2 wide with no lights, and the back of her ended up striking the reef, and she sunk on the spot. No lives were lost, although Bluenose herself was a write-off. To the best of our knowledge, Bluenose was never a rum runner. if she ran rum, it was a very, very well kept secret. But no, to the best of our knowledge, Bluenose was not a rum runner. Though there were, of course, Lunenburg schooners that did engage in rum running. So to give you a sense of, again, of the living conditions that would have been, that could have been found aboard these vessels. There's a story out of Blue Rocks, which is located roughly 10-minute drive, maybe a little less than 10 minutes outside of Lunenburg. There was a man who was a dory fisher out of Blue Rocks, and he would arrive in Lunenburg, and then he would row his dory from Lunenburg back home to his fish shack in Blue Rocks. And when his wife had a pretty good sense that she should start expecting him home, she would keep an eye open for his dory. And when she saw him coming, she would run down to the fish shack and she would put a fresh set of clothes down in the fish shack and some soap. And he would have to bathe in the ocean before even coming into the house. He'd bathe, put on a fresh set of clothes, and then he could go up. But his actual clothes would be weighted down in a tidal pool with a rock for 2 weeks before being brought up to the house and boiled in a great big pot outside of the house. And it was only then, after it had spent 2 weeks in the ocean and been boiled, that the clothes were actually permitted to go back into the house. There's another fishing captain. He's from Newfoundland, but who spent a lot of time in Lunenburg and ended up as crew on Bluenose, and he remarked that they had some time and they were in port, places like St. John's, they would often go to a local theater. They always wanted to watch westerns. They never wanted to watch anything about the sea. They knew enough about the sea, so they'd go and try to catch a western. He said that was the occasion in which they would shave and they would put on their fresh shore clothes and they'd get all cleaned up. And he said they'd sit down and they'd still have 2 or 3 rows to themselves because nobody would dare sit close to them. Another sort of similar story. There's always a gurry bucket. The gurry bucket was often kept kind of on deck near the hatch that would go down into the galley. And if you can kind of imagine, the hatch would have a ladder that would go down into the galley, and then you'd see the galley table. The galley table would be there, and the captain would sit at the end of the galley table, so very close to the hatch, which could be handy. It could mean that he was accessible, for example. But there was one day there out on the banks when all the boys were out in their dories, and it was just the captain and the cook hanging out in the galley, and the cook was sitting down to a meal, and they hit a rogue wave, and the gurry bucket got sent down the hatch, hit the captain in the back of the head. Gurry spilled all across the entire table, and the cook said that he cursed for 10 minutes straight and didn't repeat himself once. A gurry bucket is where all the nasty leftovers from fish that weren't thrown over were kept. But also the gurry bucket you might keep, for example, livers and tongues in there before they made it into the specific barrels. Bluenose really represented a marriage between labor and recreation. It broke down barriers and transformed public perceptions of fishermen. Men who often were kind of looked upon, with potentially in a discriminatory manner, were all of a sudden being welcomed into social circles of the elite and being celebrated by people across not only Nova Scotia and Canada, but really elsewhere in the world and down into the United States. And I think that this is a part of what made Bluenose such an important vessel, and part of why her legacy continues today is that it really it took what was a real sort of working class industry, a blue collar industry, and put it in the spotlight, and it celebrated these workers, and it celebrated workers at a time when things were challenging for people. We had just come out of World War I and the Spanish flu, and people were looking for a good news story and something to celebrate. And this was an opportunity. This presented an opportunity to celebrate the province and the country's achievements, the skill and the long-standing tradition of Nova Scotia boat builders and seafarers, and it really it brought an important part of East Coast and maritime culture into the homes of people across the country. There was a reporter in the 1930s from Toronto who wrote that Bluenose stitched the nation together, and she became a household name. And I think that today, her legacy continues to build and continues on. So one part of the history of the schooner that's been hotly debated is the actual origin story. There is a long-standing story that goes back, actually right back into the late 18th century, that suggests that the schooner was invented in Gloucester in 1712. Sometimes it's said 1713, but that 1712, 1713 range. And there's quite an elaborate story that Captain Andrew Robinson from East Gloucester launched the first schooner at his shipyard in Smith's Cove in Gloucester. And as she kind of glided out across the water, a spectator said, "Oh, look how she scoons." And Robinson said, "Well, a schooner let her be." And the story is that's basically the birth of the schooner. Now, this story has been widely debated and widely disputed, and is, in large part has sort of been dismissed now. There's pretty strong evidence to suggest that the schooner rig was actually first used, probably at least 100 or 200 years earlier in Europe, and the terminology schooner may have even come from Europe, not from North America. But I think that we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. In my opinion, Captain Andrew Robinson did not invent the schooner, but in all likelihood, he did launch the first one in Massachusetts or potentially North America. And there's a few reasons for that. I mean, we do know, and I've done a lot of research into Captain Andrew Robinson, and I excavated a fishing station that he owned on the Kansas Islands. And Robinson did own a shipyard in Smith's Cove, and he did own schooners early on. By the second decade of the 18th century at the latest, we know that Captain Andrew Robinson did have schooners. The other thing, though, and the thing I think perhaps is more compelling, is the story was said to have been written down in a journal belonging to Dr. Moses Prince, and this was, there's records of this journal existing in the early 19th century, and this story kind of being discussed in the early 19th century, but it is now gone. It's vanished, which of course helps sort of build arguments against that story, and that evidence no longer exists. However, from my research, I can tell you that Dr. Moses Prince owned a fishing station on the other side of the cove from Andrew Robinson in Kansas. So his fishing station was maybe 200 meters away from Andrew Robinson's, and they had a personal relationship back in Massachusetts as well. So I think it is very likely that Moses did witness the launching of what was seen as a new vessel in Gloucester Harbor in the early 18th century. And there's a good chance actually that at that point they didn't even realize that type of rig had been used before, and that type of vessel had been used before.
In 1497, Italian explorer John Cabot, returning from a voyage to the New World, exclaims that the sea is so thick with teeming fish they can be scooped up with a basket. The fish Cabot is boasting about is the Atlantic cod. The sea he's referring to is off the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, which is the largest of 20 or so offshore banks. Why cod flourish in this area is because the banks are part of a series of shallow undersea plateaus. The plateaus range from 30 to 180 meters in depth and stretch almost 320 kilometers from shore before they drop off to 1,800 meters or more. With the icy Labrador Current, the warm waters of the Gulf Stream, and the freshwater current of the St. Lawrence, all colliding together over the banks, ideal conditions are created for the cod's favorite food source, phytoplankton. With Europe's insatiable demand for fish, North America's eastern seaboard comes alive during the cod rush, and for centuries provides European markets with thousands of tons of salted cod each year. By 1921, the year Bluenose is launched, fishing off the banks is slowly transitioning from sail to diesel. But still, even though Bluenose is a fishing schooner designed to race, catching fish is how her captain, Angus J. Walters, and her crew earned their living, with all the fishermen sharing the profits made from their catch. Life at sea is full of danger. Success depends on vigilance, luck, and tireless work in some of the worst conditions imaginable. Once on the banks, Bluenose's crew bait their thousands of hooks and ready their 4.5-meter dories in the early hours of the morning before sunrise. The dory, with its flat bottom, is the reliable workhorse of the Grand Banks fishery. It can hold more than 2 tons of cod or halibut and is extremely seaworthy, empty or filled. Bluenose comes equipped with 8 two-man dories. The fishermen must supply their own gear, which includes a full set of oilskins and their own pair of 3-meter oars. The dories are either launched as a flying release and tethered in a row behind her stern to be later released, or they are launched when Bluenose is at anchor and fan out in all directions to cover 20 square kilometers of sea in one pass. For up to 6 times, the fishermen bring their catches back to Bluenose and reset their hooks. The nights are spent cutting, splitting, and salting the fish before the fishermen can steal away an hour or 2 of sleep. Fishing off the banks is an incredibly hard way to earn a living. But the only guarantees a fisherman has are sore muscles, a wet backside, and a little money in return. When 2 schooners head for home from the banks, a race surely ensues. And if one of those schooners is Bluenose, the outcome is rarely in doubt. Getting back to port first means getting the best prices for her haul and coveted bragging rights.